Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart. Let's paint a Wood Elf Glade Guard for Warhammer the Old World. Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet. This classic article by Mike McVeigh about his Wood Elf army in White Dwarf 141, my fourth ever issue of White Dwarf, stuck with me for years. I probably read this article so many times and inspired me to try and paint my first ever elves. I had a mixture of high elves and wood elves at the time. I called it an army. I'm not sure many other people would, but it stuck with me, and I've always loved Mike's painting, and it was probably this catalyst, this first painting article, that really kind of turned me to his style of painting, but also wood elves really. Aside from that small Wood Elf collection back in 3rd edition, I didn't play them again or do anything with them really till 8th edition. I picked up a few things then when the release of that army book and had the intention of having an army, but it was one of those projects that never really got off the ground. But I do love the more modern imagery, and I want to do something that's kind of reminiscent of that in the paint job I'm going to do today. So I've primed the miniature black, and I am giving it a quick zenithal highlight with the airbrush here, just white over the top. This isn't essential for this. If you want to follow this on along and you haven't got an airbrush, it doesn't matter. You don't need to do this for this paint job. I'm doing it because it helps a little bit in terms of light placement. It helps you see where the details of the miniature are, and it will help a little bit when you're putting certain colours on the miniature. But you don't need to do it. It also really helps you see the miniature in the early stages. It's so hard to see a black miniature on the screen, so you'll be able to see what's going on a lot easier as well. Now, these are by no means all of the colours I'm going to be using on this miniature, but I wanted to work it in triads, partly because I'm going to be using so many different greens and browns on the miniature, it can all get a little bit messy. So I'm using this mixture here. These are all triads from Two Thin Coats, but I'm using them in their triad sets, so I can just pick an area and go, right, this green is going to be used from this triad, and so on and so on. And it's really helpful when there's so many different greens and browns on a single miniature to have set little recipes before you start, so you don't have to buy triads, but maybe try and work out your groupings beforehand before you do it. These ones here are the kind of the earthy tones that I'll be using, but I'm starting off with a flesh recipe, one of my favorites. And I'm starting off with dwarf skin first, and this is going over that sort of whitish face from the zenithal. Now, if you're not doing the zenithal part of this, you probably want to adjust your flesh recipe to a triad as well. I'm using elven skin, which is the highlight of one of the Two Thin Coats triads as the final highlight for this. So if you're not using zenithal, you could use the other two from that range, which would be barbarian flesh and dwarven skin. But once that base layer of dwarf skin is dry, I'm going back with deep purple, which is another express colour. I thin this slightly on the palette, and I'm doing a little bit of a glaze around the bottom half of the face and the nose to add some colour. And I'm also adding a little bit of colour in between the fingers and on the tops of the hands, so it doesn't look quite so bleached out. So there's a little bit of warmth there. In the slightly darker areas, I'm using gloomy violet, just a lovely way to add a little bit of shadow and add a third tone to your skin recipe, along with that redder, warmer, deep purple, and the base of the dwarf skin works perfectly. As I said, if you want to build up with a triad and work your way up, that's absolutely fine, and that will work just as well. And what I'm doing here is going back with the top of that triad, that elven skin, and just picking out the cheekbones and the nose, keeping this paint quite thin. I don't want any thick brush marks, and it just blends in really nicely of how that dwarf skin settles over the underpainted miniature. And after I've just dotted in the eyes, I like to do this now, just in case I mess it up, I go back and just tidy up a little bit more, add an even brighter highlight with that elven skin, and we're done on the skin already. For the main brown on the elf, I've actually turned to this dark skin triad recipe from Two Thin Coats, and we have druid flesh, paladin flesh and bard skin. And like I do with all the triads in this process, I'm working up with a layering process. So a base coat, a mid-tone and a highlight. Now, I don't always leave it there. There might be a slight darkening in some places. There might be a further highlight depending on what I feel is needed. But they're a really good way to kind of work your painting around, and the planning for your painting, which is which colours are you going to use and where are you going to place them. So I'm just going around putting that base layer down for that darkest colour on the areas that I've decided that are going to be brown. You can make it up, you can use the guides and the artwork you saw at the beginning of the video as a bit of a sort of a guide to follow, or just place it where you like. As we get onto that second layer, which is paladin flesh, I'm just making sure they're not completely obliterating the base layer. You're probably covering about 70 to 80% here, so you're making sure that the darker colour is there as a shadow. Some areas it's really easy to work out where that second layer and third layer of paint is going to go, especially if there's a ridge or a furrow, a really defined area. Sometimes, like this head covering here, it's not quite as easy. You might put a softer blend between the different areas, and here, because the light would hit so much on that head covering, quite a lot of it gets that mid-tone. Now generally, but not always, when I'm using a triad like this top highlight is going to be a lot thinner, quite often thin line highlights. Sometimes if it's a really large area, you may want to do a slightly blended layer between the three colours, but quite often here I'm trying to make it pop, and that's what I'm doing here, just thin lines around the edges of the shoes, where the light would catch on the bow, around the edges of the belt, and so on and so on. And with thinner lines becomes need to be a lot more careful here and take it a little bit slower, because you don't want to go over the lines, get into those gaps and ruin those shadow areas. So this is the most time consuming part, but it's also really good brush control practice, and it's really pleasing when you get a nice thin line on there. And I'm not going super thin on this isn't heavy metal style, this is just following that basic layer style of painting, but it's still very pleasing when it looks quite neat at the end of the finish. Now this is Argonaut skin, which is actually a base layer of another flesh triad, but I just wasn't happy with the brown at the edge. I really wanted it to pop, so I'm just doing a little 50-50 mix with the previous highlights, and it just added that little bit of punch that was needed right on those edges. Just a very thin line here or there, maybe not in all places, but definitely where the light would hit, just to make it pop and stand out a little bit more. Now again, because I've done a zenithal prime here, I can use the Andean yellow really effectively over that, because the little bits of shadow that are built into that will just really enhance the way this contrast paint works. You can obviously put this straight over a white as well, but it doesn't have quite that same depth. Again, if you're going over black here, you probably want to build up from a darker tone first, and then through the triad or however many colours you want to put into that. But right now, because it's going to take a little while to dry, I'm just painting in the yellow hair at this stage. Also taking the opportunity to use contrast skeleton horde and all the little laces and little ties and things. There's a little tie there on the head dress. There's some laced areas on the front, and I can be a little bit messy with it. If it overspills, it doesn't really matter, because I'm going to go in with the green in a moment anyway, using it on the handles of the swords, on the back as well. There's a little bit of rope on the shafts of the arrows and so on. And then while I'm at it is apothecary white. I'm just going to be using it for the feathers on the top of the arrows. These all take a little bit of time to dry, so I can apply them now before I start working on the green, and then by the time I've done the green, these will all be ready to work on for their final highlights later in the video. So now we're into these three green triads, and the first one is Orc Hide, Goblin Horde green, and Troll Snot green. Now all of these paints from Two Thin Coats have a Citadel equivalent. If you go to the Transatlantic Games website, you can see their colour conversion charts, and it'll convert it over to Citadel. So for those of you that are Citadel users, you'll be able to get a pretty close approximation of these colours. And now I'll talk again a little bit more about why I chose these triads. This is the best example of this is with these greens. There's so many different greens involved. If I just went in with, oh, I'm going to use this base colour green and then this base colour green, oh, what highlight colour I'm going to use for that. It could get quite messy and maybe not use the right green in the right place. And because there are 3 different green recipes on one single miniature, using these triads or pre-organising into triads is just so important, so that you've got a really good plan, you know what you're doing at each stage, and I can just work to completion now on a particular green before I move on to the next one. In terms of method, it's exactly the same as it did with the brown. So we are layering colours here. So that mid-tone that's going on now is very much sort of 70% covering. Depends on the area of the miniature, of course. And you're just building up those highlights slowly. And because the colours are in a nice triad, you tend to get a nice transition from one to the other. And as we get to that top highlight of the troll snot green, you can really see it start to pop there, and just going in very much with a little edge highlight here and there, keeping it nice and neat and tidy, and it looks great. So on to that next green triad. This is Fury Green, Gung Ho Green and Green Beret, and they're much more desaturated, almost, not just the names, but in terms of the tones, have more of a military feel to them. So I've decided to use them for the bulk of the clothing on the body there, and I'll leave the more vibrant green for the cloaks and the more sort of spot areas, and you'll see that as we get onto that stage. But again, exactly the same method here. So going around trying to be really neat, because we don't want to mess up the stuff we've already finished. That's one thing with painting like this: when you complete a colour, you've got to be neat and not go on to the next part. But going around, picking out all the areas I want to be within this green recipe, this triad, and getting a nice neat flat base coat down. The actual colour changes in this triad are quite subtle, which is really nice in the body of the miniature here. There's less texture, there's less hard edges, so doing a smoother transition between the colours and lighter in the centre of the area that you're painting at that point just seems to work really, really nicely. And because of that, when we get to the top highlight, the green beret, I'm trying to keep it in very focused areas and go back and do a second coat just to reinforce it a little bit and give it that extra punch. I don't want it to be too bright and stand out. I want this to be more subtle, but I do want the transitions to be visible. The third and final green triad is Wyvern Green, Emerald Green and Ethereal Green, and these are quite strong, punchy colours. The base coat is quite dark, requires a couple of thin coats. This one, the coverage isn't quite as good as some of the other colours. Still a lovely paint, but it does require a couple of thin colours. So if you're going over black, you may find that even more, though the slightly translucent nature of it will mean that you can build up layers really nicely and actually show some of that shadow through. So it's not a bad thing. It actually helps quite well with the way I'm painting here. So basically going around here and filling in all of the areas of the clothing that I haven't yet put any colour on, because everything that's left is going to be this green. And at this stage I've decided I'm quite happy with the colours I've chosen. You never really know till you put them on the miniature, but the 3 different green triads and the brown mixed together do work well. When it came to the cloak, I decided this lovely leaf pattern on the back, I'm not sure if it's supposed to be a pattern or actual leaves, that I was going to leave those white. So I'm being very careful when I paint in the dark green not to go over them too much. If I do get paint on them, I can go back and touch it up, because I am going to be using some contrast and I want that sort of white effect underneath the contrast paint to give it the punch it needs. Then, much like before, it's a matter of building up the mid-tone, in this case the emerald green, mostly covering here, leaving a little bit of that darker colour in the recesses. This takes quite a while, and you've got to be a little bit more careful with the shadowed areas on the cloak. It's quite a large area, so making sure that you're putting the right amount of mid-tone in, but not lightening it too much where the shadow is there. Luckily, these paints are really smooth and they layer really nicely, and they also wet blend really well. And on the larger, flatter areas like the cloak there, I found I needed to wet blend quite a lot. The emerald green was just perfect for those really nice thin edge style highlighting, so really picking out either the edges of a particular area or a ridge that's showing up there, so where the folds and the clothing peak. It's a nice thin line, it just makes it pop. I like to go on the bottom of those areas as well. You see these shin guards here, and just the faintest little lines there just really make a huge difference, really making the green pop and stand out. And at this stage it's really starting to come together, and like I mentioned before, it's worth taking your time with this final layer. If you're doing it, you may have decided not to do this final layer and you're just following along but leaving off the edge highlighted bits, and I don't blame you, especially if you are painting these for a whole army. I'm just doing a single miniature here. When it came to the larger area on the cloak, I knew this was going to be a little bit harder. So I started by going around and just covering the edge first and seeing how that looked. But I knew I was going to have to paint in some of this lighter emerald green quite away up that cloak, rather than just relying on the thin edge style highlights. It's just too much of a large area, and I think it would look a little bit odd if you'd only had a light just going around the edge. So I started to focus it on the tip of the cloak there, and then wet blending it in. Started by feathering it out, but because I had all those colours on my wet palette, I was able to grab the mid-tone and wet blend on the miniature on the cloak, and making sure there was a nice smooth transition. So this is Contrast Garrigach Sewer, a really nice mid-brown. And I mentioned towards the beginning of the video that sometimes those triads aren't enough. You want to add a fourth highlight, or sometimes you want to reinforce a shadow. We've added a fourth highlight earlier on with the brown to make it pop more. For me, the shadows just aren't quite dark enough or punchy enough either, so I'm going back with this Garrigach Sewer and just adding a little bit of shadow in. And I tend to do here is find the area I want to be shadowed, put a little line in, and then clean it off my brush and just wet blend it or feather it out a little bit so it's smooth. Works really well. You're always glazing here at this stage. It just makes those shadows a little bit better. So this is Contrast Cygor Brown. I'm going to be using this as the base for all of that sort of leafy wooden area that's on the back of the cloak, that design there. Now it's going over the white, no problem at all. And the reason I've picked Cygor Brown, it's got reddish tones to it. So I want to make this look fairly autumnal, and the idea is I'm going to highlight with a reddish brown, but also some oranges as well. And because of the warm reds within this brown, it will highlight nicely to the orange as well as the redder brown as well. Now for some model colour from Vallejo for the first time in the tutorial, and this is Hull Red and Orange Brown, and these are the two colours that I'm going to be using to achieve that effect I was just talking about. So all of the leaves will get a bit of a highlight, and some of the branches or stems, whatever they are, will as well. I will leave some pure Cygor Brown in as well in the shadows. I want to build those tones, and because it's gone over a white area, I've already got a little bit of natural highlight built in there anyway. But when I come in with the orange brown and being a little bit more selective with it, so not every single leaf will get a highlight. So you've got a bit of a mixture between brownish leaves and orangish leaves. And there's 3 or 4 different tones there now. And that's just enough to kind of trick the eye or make the eye think that it's looking at an autumnal leaf. And as you can see here, I come back with a second pass on that orange brown on some of the leaves. And it just really starts to make it pop, and I'm quite happy with the effect. I think it looks pretty cool. There's not loads of metallics on this paint job. This is black metal as my base silver here, just for the blade. And this is Necro Gold, which I'll be using on the hilts and the pommels of the sword and the dagger. Both of these paints are from the Scale 75 Metal and Alchemy range. And this is Game Air Silver for my top highlight on that steel, on that metal area, and just focusing on a nice thin line along the top edge of the blade, but allowing it to sort of blend down to that middle section of the blade as well. And this paint is great, it just blends out really, really nicely. Rather fittingly, we have Elven Gold from that same Metal and Alchemy range for the highlights on all of the gold. I'm also using the same gold recipe for this little area on the back. Now, I don't know what these are. My Wood Elf knowledge was very much 3rd edition, and I didn't read all the lore, so I'm not sure what these little things hanging on the back of the quiver are. Someone can let me know, but I'm going to be painting them in gemstone style thing. So I'm underpainting them here. I'm starting with the gold, which includes highlighting the same way as I did for the gold on the other areas of the miniature, so the Necro Gold and then the Elven Gold highlights, before coming in with some little targeted, almost reverse teardrop highlights of just the silver. There's a reason for this we'll come back to in a moment, but we're painting them almost upside down gemstone style. Time for a little bit more model colour from Vallejo, and this is Iraqi Sand. This is a sort of off creamy white, and I'm using it to go over all the areas that were Skeleton Horde contrast paint, all those little laces or little stitching and things. Not forgetting the things on the back, so the bit of the rope and the shafts of the arrows as well. Back to some two thin coats, and this is Trooper White. This is a slightly off white compared to the brilliant pure white, and I'm just using this on the feathers on the arrows as well, leaving that grey colour that we've got from the Apothecary White contrast paint. So I'm really just picking out the highlight areas just to really make it pop. And onto Yellow Flame from Two Thin Coats. This is a top of one of their little triads, and it's just a really nice colour for doing a top highlight on a yellow. And because we've base coated with Iandan Yellow over the Zenithal Prime, we've got some shadow showing already, so I'm just reinforcing those strands of hair, picking out where the light hits, and it really pops almost straight away. And then because I had a little bit of that Trooper White on my palette next to the yellow, just 50-50 mix, and I'm able to go in and just add a few areas where it really pops, just where the light is catching right on the top of the head. Now we have these technical paints, the Spirit Stone Red and Soul Stone Blue. They used to do a green as well. I don't know whether they still make these. I've had these for ages. They last forever. They're great fun and a really good way of doing quick Spirit Stones and things like that. And because we have underpainted with that metallic, so that's why we added the little bit of silver. When you paint these on, that shows through if you do a nice thin coat. So it's just the easiest way of doing a really quick Soul Stone or a Spirit Stone or any kind of stone like that. It was great on lenses for lights on 40k vehicles, that kind of thing. Use green all the time. That's why the green's gone. I need to see if I can still get some, but if you haven't got those, contrast paints are great from these as well. But if you want it to be glossy, you can always add a little bit of gloss varnish afterwards, but really easy to do. And because you're doing this over the top of something that's underpainted, your underpainting doesn't have to be as neat and as tidy as it would be if you were just painting that detail in. So if you're painting in a Spirit Stone and want it to do neat transitions and look perfect, you have to be really neat and do loads of layers. You can be much looser with it if you're underpainting. Because this is a filter over the top, it just softens all those edges and makes it look a lot more skillful than it really is. Very much on to the finishing touches now. This is a ready mixed oil paint grease. If you haven't got this, a bit of Agrax Earthshade will be fine. I just like using this. Very little bit around the hilt and the pommel and going onto the blade, just to add a little bit of shadow and depth on there, make it look like real metal. I'd already based the miniature earlier, you'll have seen that, just so it was ready and dry. So this is Vallejo Earth texture and Dark Earth. Because that's dry, I'm using the same oil paint on there as well, rather than, again, like an Agrax Earthshade or something like that. Either or will do. I just love using my oil paints. And once that oil paint is dry, I'm just brushing a little bit of light pigment. This is light sienna on there. I will blow the excess off and I won't be fixing it. It's just to add a little bit of extra texture and tone. And then because it's Wood Elves, it's time to have a little bit of fun. So I'm adding some tufts on, which you'd expect anyway. But also a little bit of yellow flower, just a tiny little section. You don't want to overdo it. Then a little bit of mud effect. This is European mud effect from that same Vallejo Deer Armor range that the basing texture comes from. And then a few other little details scattered on, some little basing mix here, the odd little leaf here and there. They are Wood Elves after all. They need to look like they're in their right habitat. And there we are, one finished Glade Guard Wood Elf. And that was really fun to do, and it's always fun to do when they're painted in isolation like this rather than having to do big units of them. Now I had a lot of fun with that. I loved working with the different greens and browns. The triads all worked well. And I've met my vision, what I had in my mind at the beginning of the paint job, what I wanted to achieve with all those different colours. If I was doing this for an army, would I do it like this? Potentially, because there's low figure count in a Wood Elf army. There's a few more highlights that maybe I'd like to do for rank and file if I had huge blocks of 30 or 40 to do. Because you're working with small numbers with Wood Elves, it's probably the kind of recipe that I would follow. I'm not saying it's a very high-end paint job by saying that, but it's all about not driving yourself mad when you're painting whole armies as well. But I'm pretty happy with the way it came out, and I think I could do another 9 of those or 20 in total to have in an army or so. I don't think you're having too many more than that with modern Warhammer the Old World builds. But let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to know if you're working on Wood Elves, and are you excited when they finally get around to releasing their Arcane Journal? I wonder if they're going to be last at this rate. But all good stuff, and I had lots of fun doing this. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have making it. If you're new to the channel, please do check out the other content. There's loads of Warhammer the Old World content, much of it hobby related, tutorial based like this, but loads of discussion and things as well.
I cover loads of other game systems, so there may be something you find that relates to another game you play, so have a good scoot around. There's hundreds of videos to choose from. If you'd like to support the channel, there's loads of affiliate links in the video description below. Don't forget my channel sponsor, Baron of Dice, as well. There's a link there, and you get a discount if you click through the links. Some wonderful dice available from them. If you'd like to support me more directly, I have a Patreon. There's a link in the video description for that. And there are 4 tiers, and I've just started doing monthly giveaways, which I may have mentioned earlier in the video, so it's a good time to join up. But thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.
Hurry up, Dieter! I'm bursting! Dieter, sometimes I think you're half troll, and you've used all the paper. Now I can't go. Feel like I'm being watched.